What's going on YouTube? It's your boy Cyclops, and I got a real treat for everybody out there that's a real 90s head. For anybody who's into like vintage and throwback or just like history of pop culture, etc. Today we're going to be talking about a character that I think a lot of people don't really associate with the 90s and doesn't get talked about a lot as being like a 90s icon. And that character is Batman, right? So before I get into it, let me kind of explain where I'm coming from, right? I am a child of, I was born in the 80s, but 90s is like my childhood, right? So, I mean, I grew up with like all the different animated series, X-Men, Spider-Man. I mean, you had Power Rangers, Ninja Turtles. Despite what people might think, Ninja Turtles was still hot in the 90s, even though it's like an 80s kind of property. In the 90s, people always say like we had some of the best music. You had Tupac, Biggie, all sorts of other great artists. You had all the cool movies, Independence Day, Jurassic Park, The Matrix, so on and so forth, right? But one property a lot of people don't talk about as being like hot, like white hot in the 90s is Batman. So that's what I'm going to kind of break down today. Like when it comes to the animated series, right? A lot of people point to X-Men, right? Like X-Men was like the dopest cartoon in the 90s. X-Men, right? I mean, they even have the X-Men 92 comic book. For those that don't know, the X-Men show in the 90s is very iconic. A lot of people consider the characters in that show as like the definitive X-Men. I mean, Cyclops, Jean, Storm, Wolverine, so on and so forth. So it's so popular that Marvel actually, in recent days, like in the last 2 or 3 years, I want to say, as I'm filming this is 2023. So I want to say last like 2 years, they came out with a comic book called X-Men 92, which is literally a comic book that picks up where that TV show left off, just because Marvel finally realized, like, man, this show has like a cult following, and rightfully so. But, people don't always talk about, like, man, in the 90s, you had Batman, the animated series, which has been talked about by, I'm sure, multiple other, YouTubers and content creators. I mean, Warner Brothers did come out with like all different kinds of anniversary sets with physical copies of like DVD and Blu-ray of the Batman animated series from the 90s. I've even seen like coffee table art books going through like the whole history of that show. But again, I kind of want to give like my personal take, not just on the show, but like I'm actually going to go into Batman as a whole and how culturally relevant it was in the 90s, right? So let's take a little step back. We're going to talk about the Batman and Batman Returns movies with Michael Keaton, right? Me personally, two of the best action, two of the best comic book related movies ever made that a lot of people would say doesn't hold up against like the End Games, the Watchmen, and all the other like more modern comic book movie properties. But like as a kid of the 80s and of the 90s, you got to understand there wasn't a lot of movie properties. There wasn't a lot of live action comic book and superhero properties being made back then. So it was a huge deal that we had those two Batman movies. And then Fox, I believe it was Fox Kids. I remember where I lived, it was Channel 11, Fox Kids. I'm in Southern California, by the way. And they came out with Batman, the animated series, which was shot in a very like dark and noirish style to match the Batman and Batman Returns movies, which were directed by Tim Burton. And those movies were very dark, very what you would call film noir, where there's a lot of like dark shadows and Batman coming out of the shadows, and Gotham City's not really well lit. And that's how the TV show was actually done that way in animated form. And one thing that TV show did, and I'm actually going to segue into this comic book in a second here, but one thing that TV show did was really flesh out Batman's villains. I mean, Batman has like this deep, rich rogues gallery, meaning he's just got tons and tons of villains that are very unique, have different motivations. And that TV show, that cartoon show, really showcased the history and personalities of each and every one of those villains. So it didn't just focus on Batman and his kind of circle of influence, but it really did a deep dive on all these villains that I personally didn't know. I wasn't really into the Batman comics back then. Back then I collected like Spider-Man, Captain America, maybe a little bit of like Spawn. I was probably just barely getting into Spawn at the time. So like that, if it wasn't for that cartoon show, I wouldn't know like all the Batman villains that I know now, or wouldn't really have gotten into them. So that cartoon, man, was a huge hit, and it actually spun off into a couple other shows. There was the Batman New Adventures, which was made by the same kind of creative team, but it took like a different direction artistically, and it introduced a lot of Batman's other crime-fighting partners. Like it introduced a new Robin. It actually showed the original Robin turn into Nightwing. It gave a little bit more spotlight on the relationship between Batman and Batgirl, and also kind of built upon like all the other villains as well. And then much later in the 90s, so like the late 90s, they actually spun off into a completely different show called Batman Beyond, which dealt with a future Gotham City where the original Batman, also known as Bruce Wayne, is kind of older. He's not as, athletic, and his body is not as good shape as it was before. So he kind of passes the mantle of Batman to this other kid by the name of Terry McGinnis. And I want to say Batman Beyond, that show, it went maybe about like, I want to say like 2-3 seasons, maybe more, maybe less. I'm just kind of guessing. But recently that TV show has kind of made a comeback in the comic books. I personally don't read much of them, but I do know, I believe it's the Batman the White Knight, or Batman Beyond the White Knight series, actually introduces and canonizes Terry McGinnis, meaning the character Batman Beyond, whose real name is Terry McGinnis from the TV shows, from the cartoons. They've actually introduced him into the comic books as now an official comic book character in the DC Comics universe. So he actually exists now in the DC Comics form. And they've done stuff like that with other characters I'm not going to go into, but if you're interested, they did that with Harley Quinn. Marvel did that with X-23, and I'm sure there's others that I can't think of off the top of my head. But with that, I'm actually going to talk about, in a second here, I want to talk more about the villains and go into this beautiful comic book right here next to me. But I'm going to talk about the movies in a second. So before I do that, let's take a look. This is a CGC 9.6 graded Detective Comics 1027. That means this is the 1027th issue of Detective Comics. For those that don't know, Detective Comics is the comic book where Batman makes his first appearance ever, like in history. And it was Detective Comics issue 27. And I don't even try to quiz me on what year that was. I want to say that was probably like the 30s or 40s, long time ago. And they made this issue. This is the 1000th comic book since the Batman was introduced in comic book form. Beautiful cover by an amazing artist by the name of Art Adams. Let me try to kind of zoom in on that. You got Art Adams actually signed this. This is what you call a CGC signature series. So right there in pink, that's the actual artist's signature. And then this is a hard plastic casing that the comic book is inside right now. So if you can see, we got a few villains. We got Poison Ivy, Killer Croc. We got Catwoman right there. Obviously Batman right there being showcased. And then on the back of this guy, there's a ton of other villains. This is what I'm talking about when you talk about like Batman just has like a crazy, gallery of villains. You got Riddler down here, Penguin, Bane. That big brown guy is Clayface. You got Mr. Freeze. You got Scarecrow. A whole bunch of other characters. You got Mad Hatter right here, and some more that I'm probably missing out. Oh, you got Two-Face right there at the bottom, and then you got what's his name, Man-Bat, up at the top right here. So really amazing comic book. If you can track this down, this is definitely one that I recommend having in the collection, just because it's just beautiful art and has a ton of characters. I might do a YouTube video where I break down the work of this artist. He's a legend in the comic book industry, legendary artist. Switching gears a little bit, I want to talk now about the movies. I briefly mentioned the Michael Keaton movies, Batman and Batman Returns. When Batman came out, guys, it was a huge hit. I feel like people give it a bad rap now because of, you know, things like the special effects, maybe the acting, maybe the story, etc., etc. But man, when that movie came out, it was a huge hit. It still holds a really special place for me. I think Michael Keaton is one of the best actors. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but he's kind of coming back in the new Flash movie, so that tells you something, right? But then Batman Returns came out. And Batman Returns, I actually just watched that again recently, the other night, about a week ago. That movie to me still holds up, man. I mean, Michelle Pfeiffer, she kills it, which, you know, it's crazy timing because Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania is about to come out, and everyone's saying Michelle Pfeiffer steals the show in that movie. So, I mean, she crushes it as Catwoman in Batman Returns. Danny DeVito as the Penguin is one of the most gruesome, crazy looking villains ever. The makeup department did a great job on him, and he does a great job acting that part out. You had Christopher Walken was a villain in that movie. So that movie actually had like 3 main villains in it. Michael Keaton, I feel like Michael Keaton in Batman Returns, the second Batman movie, I feel like he kind of loosens up a little, and you could tell he's kind of having more fun with the character, which a lot of people I think don't like, right? They want the fans, I'm a fan, but the I guess purists or whatever you want to call it, you know, they want these actors to play like a part, and it's got to be like on beat with the comic book or on beat with the source material. And I like a little bit of room for like the actor, the performer, to be a little creative and mix it up a little, you know. I'm trying not to go on too much of a tangent, but I'm one of the guys who loved the Fat Thor, right? In Endgame, when Thor has the beer belly and he's crying and he's whining and he's got the dreads and everything. I thought that was brilliant. And you can tell Chris Hemsworth, the actor, the Thor actor, you could tell he's having fun with it, right? Like when you're having fun with it, I'm having fun with it, right? I just think it's cool when the actors get to let loose a little bit. So going into a little bit more controversial territory, I want to talk about Batman Forever and the next sequel, Batman Returns, which both of those are 90s movies, okay? And I grew up in the 90s and I saw all 4 movies in theaters, okay? Batman Forever with Val Kilmer. The reason I liked it as a kid is Jim Carrey's in it. I had no clue who Val Kilmer was. I had no clue who Nicole Kidman was, no clue who Tommy Lee Jones was. Chris O'Donnell was like a brand new actor, which I actually liked him in that movie. I thought he was like a cool, like punk rock, rebellious, you know, Robin in that movie. But what made the movie for me personally was Jim Carrey. I mean, Jim Carrey was like the hottest actor at the time in the 90s. He had Dumb and Dumber, The Mask, Ace Ventura, Liar Liar came out around the same time, and then Cable Guy came around like in that era as well. So he was just like white hot as an actor. So I loved it just because he was in it. So good job to the casting department at Warner Brothers. Sometimes you got to cast someone, you know, just to bring in an audience, and they did that, and I thought it worked at the time. Does that movie hold up? I don't know. I think for me, it's and sorry guys, there's a truck outside. Sorry about that. I think for me, it's a little bit of nostalgia, but does it really hold up? Maybe, maybe not, right? Now let's talk about Batman and Robin, which is the fourth installment of the late 80s and 90s movies before they rebooted it with Christian Bale. Batman and Robin, you had George Clooney, who a lot of people would say George Clooney did a good job as Bruce Wayne, right? Chris O'Donnell came back. It's documented that Chris O'Donnell hated that movie. And then the villains, you had Uma Thurman as Poison Ivy, which I thought she killed it. She did a great job. I love the makeup. I thought like she had the right look and everything, and she played like a comic accurate like version of the character, right? Like she did. Like, tell me I'm wrong. She did a good job. Arnold Schwarzenegger is Mr. Freeze. Let me tell you something. Growing up, I grew up with Terminator, Predator, True Lies, Jingle All the Way. I mean, Arnold is another actor who you gotta understand. People clown on him now. People make fun of him now, and make all these memes and all these jokes. But there's no denying, man, in the 80s and the 90s, he was hot. He was one of the hottest actors. There's a reason why they still make Predator movies and Predator comics to this day. There's a reason why they keep making Terminator TV shows and Terminator movies to this day. There's a reason why they make all these memes and he has all these lines, you get to the chopper, get down, you know, all that stuff, man. He was just iconic, man. And he is, and he always will be. Did he make a good Mr. Freeze? I don't think so. Let's be real. But was he entertaining? Yes. Did he bring in the audience just because of his name? Yes. Is that movie hilarious because of him? Yes. I mean, if you're on YouTube right now, pause this video and look up Arnold Schwarzenegger, Mr. Freeze. And there's a few people who just like edited all of his parts as Mr. Freeze into a video, and it's hilarious. It's comedy, right? So there's no denying that he did something iconic and that's gonna last forever. You know, whether you think it's comic accurate or not, I don't think really matters in that case. He did his thing, right? And it's there. It's gonna stand the test of time, whether as a joke, something serious, whatever. It's just gonna always be there, right? He's in a Batman movie. He played a villain. His name was at the top of the poster, and he's not even the main character of the movie, right? So take it for what it's worth. That's another movie I went to as a kid. My dad took me and I loved it as a kid. Now I watch it because of the nostalgia and because I think it's funny. Real quick, one last thing I wanted to talk about in this video are the action figures, are the toys. The 90s, another great thing about the 90s is we had this thing called Toys R Us. Toys R Us was awesome. My mom used to always take me there and buy me all kinds of stuff. I got a box of toys that my mom saved. Shout out to my mom. I love you, Mom. She saved all of these, and now my kids play with these. I was thinking about what video to do the other day, and my kids they pulled these out of the closet, started playing with them. I was like, I should do a Batman video and talk about how hot Batman was in the 90s. I mean, you had these two right here. You had the toys based off of the animated series, and they came in like all different outfits and costumes and armor. I mean, Batman's just a great character for the toy companies because he has like a suit for every villain, or he has all these gadgets and he can switch out costumes and switch out weapons and whatnot, right? So they made like all these different types of costumes. Like that's like the true to the cartoon. Like this is the animated series version of the action figure right there. And then this one is the same toy, just in like different gear, right? So that is also the animated series. This is like a Mr. Freeze, you know, anti-Mr. Freeze armor or whatever you want to call it right there. Then, you know, the toys started with the Michael Keaton movies. So there's a Michael Keaton Batman. This is the Batman Returns era. I think Kenner was the company that made these. Might have been Mattel. I don't think it was Hasbro. I think it was Kenner that made these, the same company that made the old school Star Wars toys. So there's a Michael Keaton action figure. And then this one right here, this one's got like some paint on it or something. This is a Val Kilmer. So this is the Batman Forever, one of the Batman Forever action figures. I think these things on the side like go over his eyes or something. But anyway, I had a ton more of these. I don't know where they all are, but there you go. They came with all kinds of different gadgets. They came with like gliders that you can hook onto them. Both of these are broken. This goes with the Mr. Freeze Batman's like some type of glider. I think it shot out like a missile or something. But anyway, none of these are for sale, guys, so don't ask. These are ones I'm gonna keep. My kids love playing with them. They got paint on them. They're broken, pieces missing and whatnot, so nothing's for sale action figure wise. But yeah, the action figures were just hot, man. Toys R Us was a big deal, man. So you had, think about the 90s. You had one of the only major superheroes came out with 3 movies, right? Because Batman came out in the 80s. Then you had Batman Returns, Batman Forever, Batman Robin, all came out in the 90s. No other major superhero other than, okay, I'll say Spawn came out in the 90s, Blade, The Phantom, you had Shadow, you had Blank Man, Mystery Man. Like those were the 90s superhero movies that came out that were like blockbuster hits. Oh, you had Judge Dredd, I think Tank Girl. So like a couple indie stuff came out in the 90s. But as far as like major superheroes with like big mass following, Batman was the main one, guys. You can't deny it. TV shows, you can make an argument that the hottest TV show of the 90s, of the cartoons, animated series, I give it to you. You can make an argument that X-Men was the best one, and I'm not going to fight you on that, but you can't deny Batman. The thing about Batman that X-Men didn't do is Batman started in the 90s, the animated series, and then when they switched gears and did Batman Beyond, that went into like the late 90s. So I would argue that it lasted longer in that regard, right? X-Men might have been more popular, but I think Batman like covered more episodes and more seasons, if you include Batman Beyond, which I think you should, because it was the same people making the TV show, right? And then the toys, man. Imagine your mom and dad or your friends or whoever, or you go by yourself to the movies every summer. You got a Batman movie. Not every summer, but you know what I mean. Then you got after school, you're watching the Batman cartoon show. And then your birthday comes up, Christmas, graduation, whatever, and you go to Toys R Us, you're gonna want some Batman, okay? So I'm making the argument here that Batman is one of the top properties of the 90s, whether you think those TV shows, whether you think those movies were corny, whether you think the toys are corny, there's no denying that it was one of the top properties. Real quick, let's talk about the comics of the 90s, right? So I started getting into comic books in the 90s, and honestly, I wasn't really into Batman back then. I mean, the art was very noirish. It might have always been, or I'm not sure. I don't have a ton of Batman comic books, but in the 90s, it just didn't hit with me, really. None of the DC titles as a kid hit me the same way. Like, I mean, I grew up on the Clone Saga, Spider-Man, which I know is super corny, but that's what was going on in the 90s. And then the Heroes Reborn, I was really into Captain America, Avengers, Iron Man, the Heroes Reborn stuff. And then I was slowly probably getting more into Spawn, just because I thought Spawn looked cool. The movie, that was another one. The movie came out. There was a cartoon show on HBO. So that was another like up and coming. I wouldn't say up and coming. It was a big time property then. And yeah, when I went to the comic book store, I would look at the Batman comics, like the covers, and I just never really wasn't into them. I will say this, my cousin, one of my cousins, he had this huge framed poster on his wall, and it was like a Batman Fleer card collection, and it was like 100 little trading cards like framed in his room. And on the back of them, it would have like little snippets of like a story arc or like a character description. And I remember a lot of those cards were centered around the death of Jason Todd, which is one of the Robins who got killed in the comic books. So I remember thinking like, oh, that's like interesting. Like I didn't know there were multiple Robins. I didn't know one of them died. So that was always kind of interesting to me, but never got into the comics. I got into the Batman comics way later, in the 2000s when Grant Morrison started writing Batman. Obviously introduced Damian, did Batman R.I.P., Final Crisis, that whole era. I had, Batman Incorporated, all that stuff. The Batman and Robin comic book where Dick is Batman and Damian is Robin. That dude, he killed that one. But 90s, not so much. I know there's some classic 90s stories. Drop a comment if you read Batman in the 90s, or if you know of any good 90s Batman comics. Drop a comment, and I might go pick up that comic. But other than that, guys, let me know what you think. Was Batman really one of the top properties in the 90s? I think so, but I want to hear what you guys think. Until next time, appreciate it, guys. Follow me on Whatnot. Follow me on Instagram, Cyclops Shop. And I'll talk to you guys next time. Take care.